The settlement on Roanoke Island stood empty when the ships arrived in August of 1590. 115 colonists vanished without signs of struggle, leaving only overgrown fortifications and carved messages behind. America's first ghost town had been born, and nobody knew why. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. Imagine standing on the shore of a barrier island off the coast of what would become North Carolina, staring at a fortress that should be teeming with life, but holds only silence. This was the scene that greeted English sailors in the late summer of 1590, a vision that would haunt historians for centuries. The Roanoke colony, England's ambitious foothold in the New World, had become something far more sinister than a failed settlement. It had become a question mark carved into the very foundation of American history. The mystery began not with the disappearance itself, but with everything that led to it. Roanoke represented more than colonial ambition. It symbolized desperation, hope, and the dangerous gamble of seeking new life in an utterly foreign world. For the men, women, and children who vanished from that island, the New World had promised opportunity. Instead, it delivered an ending so complete that even their bones seemed to have been swallowed by the earth. Understanding Roanoke requires understanding the 16th century, a time when crossing the Atlantic meant weeks of disease, starvation, and storm-tossed terror. When landing on foreign shores meant facing peoples whose languages you could not speak, whose customs you could not fathom, whose tolerance for your presence was never guaranteed. The English who came to Roanoke were not seasoned explorers. Many were families, craftsmen, farmers. They brought children. They brought pregnant women. They brought dreams of land ownership and religious freedom, things denied them in an England choking on its own population growth and rigid class structures. The settlement that would become America's most famous disappearance was actually England's third attempt at colonizing Roanoke Island. The first expedition arrived in 1585 under the command of Ralph Lane, a military man whose relationship with the local indigenous population quickly soured. After nearly a year of conflict, dwindling supplies, and mounting desperation, Lane's colonists abandoned the venture when Sir Francis Drake's fleet offered them passage home. They left behind burned bridges with the native Socotan and Croatoan peoples, a legacy that would poison future attempts. The second expedition in 1586 was barely a footnote, a small holding force meant to maintain England's claim to the territory. These men either died or dispersed, their fate unclear, their disappearance a grim preview of what was to come. When Sir Walter Raleigh organized the third colonization attempt in 1587, he knew the odds were poor. Previous failures had taught harsh lessons about supply lines, indigenous relations, and the brutal reality of survival in unfamiliar terrain. Yet desperation breeds persistence, and England's need for a New World presence outweighed its respect for Roanoke's already blood-soaked ground. What made the third attempt different was its composition. This was not a military garrison, but a true colony, complete with families and the trappings of permanent settlement. They came with tools for building, seeds for planting, livestock for breeding. They came with children who laughed and played, unaware they were sailing toward oblivion. They came with John White, an artist and cartographer whose maps had documented earlier expeditions, now tasked with leading over 100 souls into the unknown. Among those souls was White's own pregnant daughter, Eleanor, carrying the child who would become Virginia Dare, the first English infant born on American soil, and one of the first to vanish from it. The ships arrived at Roanoke in July of 1587, nearly 2 years after Lane's abandonment. What they found was not encouraging. The fortifications stood in ruins, rotted by 2 years of coastal weather and neglect. Vines had reclaimed the wooden palisades. The small structures Lane's men had built were collapsing into the sandy soil. But worse than the physical decay was the atmosphere of abandonment, the sense that Roanoke had already proven itself a graveyard for English dreams. John White and his colonists had arrived at a place that screamed failure, yet they had nowhere else to go. To understand why over 100 people willingly stepped onto that cursed island, you must understand the England they fled. By the 1580s, the nation was bursting at its seams. London's streets overflowed with the displaced and desperate. The Enclosure Acts had driven farmers from ancestral lands, converting communal fields into private pastures for sheep. Wool meant profit for landowners, but it meant homelessness for tenant families who had worked the same soil for generations. Religious persecution added another layer of misery. Catholics faced fines, imprisonment, and execution. Protestant dissenters fared little better. The very act of worshiping differently could cost you everything. Spain's success in the Americas dangled before English eyes like a cruel taunt. Gold and silver poured into Spanish coffers from Mexico and Peru. New foods, new trade routes, new power. England watched from across the Channel, impoverished and envious, its treasury depleted by decades of war and political turmoil. Queen Elizabeth needed a foothold in the New World, not just for wealth, but for strategic position. If England could establish colonies, it could challenge Spanish dominance and secure its future as a global power. Sir Walter Raleigh, courtier and adventurer, received a royal charter to establish English settlements in North America. He had wealth, ambition, and the Queen's favor. What he lacked was realistic understanding of what colonization actually required. The 1585 expedition under Ralph Lane proved this immediately. Lane was a soldier, not a diplomat. When the Secatan people showed reluctance to continuously supply the English with food, Lane responded with violence. He burned villages. He took hostages. He executed a Secotán chief named Wingina, decapitating him in front of his people. These actions guaranteed that future English colonists would face hostility rather than cooperation. The indigenous peoples of the region, the Secotan, Croatoan, and others, had initially approached the strangers with curiosity. They had offered food during the first desperate months. They had shared knowledge about local crops and fishing grounds. Lane's brutality destroyed any foundation for peaceful coexistence. When his men finally abandoned Roanoke in June of 1586, they left behind burned villages and vengeful survivors. The second expedition was meant to be a placeholder, 15 men tasked with maintaining England's claim until a proper relief force could arrive. They vanished. Some historians believe they were killed by indigenous warriors seeking revenge for Lane's atrocities. Others suggest they attempted to sail home and drowned in the attempt. Their disappearance should have ended English interest in Roanoke permanently. Instead, it barely registered. Raleigh was already planning his third attempt, this time with a different approach. The 1587 colony would not be a military outpost, but a true settlement. Families, not soldiers. Farmers, not conquistadors. Raleigh recruited from England's desperate masses, people for whom the risk of death in the New World seemed preferable to slow starvation in the old. He promised land ownership, something impossible for common people in England's rigid feudal system. He promised religious freedom, the chance to worship without fear of persecution. He promised a fresh start in a land of plenty. Over 100 people believed him. They sold what little they owned to pay for passage. They said goodbye to relatives they would never see again. They boarded ships, knowing the journey alone might kill them. That disease and storms claimed half of all Atlantic crossings. They gambled everything on Raleigh's promises and their own desperate hope. Among them was John White, chosen to lead this venture because of his previous experience with the region. He brought his daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare. Eleanor was heavily pregnant, but the opportunity seemed worth the risk. They would build something new, something better. They would raise children on land they owned, free from England's crushing hierarchies. The ships departed Plymouth in May of 1587. By the time they reached Roanoke 2 months later, the illusions had already begun to crack. The pilot of the expedition, a Portuguese navigator named Simon Fernandez, had his own agenda. Raleigh's instructions were clear. Stop briefly at Roanoke to check on the 15 men left behind, then continue north to the Chesapeake Bay, where better harbors and more fertile land awaited. Fernandez refused, whether through incompetence, malice, or simple greed for a quick return voyage. He ordered the colonists off the ships at Roanoke and prepared to depart. White protested. The colonists begged. Fernandez was unmoved. This was their new home, he declared, whether they liked it or not. So they stepped onto an island already poisoned by English violence, carrying supplies meant for a different location entirely. The first task was finding the 15 men left behind the previous year. They found one skeleton, bones picked clean by scavengers, lying in the tall grass. The others had vanished completely. No graves, no signs of struggle, no clues, just absence. It was an omen the colonists tried desperately to ignore. John White proved a better leader than Ralph Lane, at least initially. He understood that survival depended on peaceful relations with the indigenous peoples. The Croatoan, who lived on Hatteras Island to the south, had maintained friendlier attitudes toward the English despite Lane's brutality. Their chief, Manteo, had actually traveled to England with earlier expeditions, learned the language, and converted to Christianity. Manteo agreed to help the new colonists, serving as interpreter and intermediary. White named him Lord of Roanoke, a largely symbolic title meant to honor the alliance. But the Socotan remembered Lane's violence. They wanted no part of English friendship. White attempted diplomatic overtures, sending messages of peaceful intent. The Socotan responded with silence. Then, in late July, barely 2 weeks after the colonists' arrival, one of White's men was found dead. George Howe had been crabbing alone in shallow water when Socotan warriors attacked, shooting him with arrows and beating his skull with wooden clubs. They left his body in the shallows, a message written in blood and bone. The colonists panicked. Some demanded immediate retaliation. Others wanted to abandon the island entirely. White, caught between maintaining order and satisfying calls for justice, authorized a raid on the nearest Socotan village. It went catastrophically wrong. The English attacked at night, finding what they thought was a Socotan settlement. They killed several people before discovering they had assaulted a Croatoan camp, slaughtering the few remaining allies they had. Manteo forgave the mistake, but the damage was done. The English had now alienated nearly every indigenous group in the region. Amid this chaos, Eleanor Dare gave birth on August 18, 1587. The child was a girl, christened Virginia after the Virgin Queen, whose charter made this doomed venture possible. Virginia Dare became the first English child born in the Americas, a symbol of hope that felt increasingly hollow as supplies dwindled and tensions mounted. White held his granddaughter and felt the weight of impossible responsibility. These people depended on him, but he was leading them toward slow starvation on an island surrounded by enemies. The colonists made their choice in late August. White must return to England for supplies and reinforcements. Without additional provisions, they would not survive the winter. Without more colonists, they could not defend themselves or establish a viable community. White refused at first. His daughter had just given birth. His granddaughter was barely 2 weeks old. How could he abandon them? But the colonists insisted. He knew the route. He knew Raleigh personally. He could secure aid faster than anyone else. They gave him no choice, really. The decision was made. Before departing, White established a protocol. If the colonists needed to leave Roanoke, they should carve their destination into a tree or post. If they left under attack or duress, they should include a Maltese cross above the carving. This simple system would, White believed, ensure he could find them upon his return. He instructed them to move inland if necessary, away from the exposed coastline. 50 miles inland, he suggested, near indigenous villages, where they might trade or integrate if circumstances demanded. White sailed from Roanoke in late August of 1587, watching the island shrink behind the ship until it disappeared into the horizon. He carried letters from the colonists to their families in England, messages filled with hope and determination. Eleanor had written to her mother, describing baby Virginia's health and expressing confidence in the colony's future. White read that letter during the crossing, memorizing every word his daughter had written. He promised himself he would return within 6 months. He promised he would bring everything they needed. He promised his daughter would see him again. The crossing took longer than expected. Storms battered the ships. Disease spread among the crew. By the time White reached England in November, he had already been gone 3 months. Winter was setting in. No ships would sail until spring at the earliest. He told himself this was acceptable. The colonists had supplies for several months. They had Manteo's guidance. They would endure until his return. He had to believe this, because the alternative was unbearable. What John White could not have known was that he would never see his daughter or granddaughter again. Events far beyond his control were about to make that promise impossible to keep. White reached London in mid-November of 1587, expecting to secure supplies and return by spring. Instead, he found a nation preparing for war. Spanish ships had been spotted gathering in ports along the European coast. King Philip of Spain, enraged by English privateering and Queen Elizabeth's support of Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, was assembling an invasion fleet. The rumors spoke of hundreds of warships, thousands of soldiers, an armada so massive it would sweep England's defenses aside like kindling. Every available vessel was being commandeered for national defense. Merchant ships, fishing boats, private yachts belonging to nobles, all were pressed into service. White's requests for a relief expedition to Roanoke were met with dismissive laughter. Did he not understand that England itself faced extinction? The Queen's advisors had no time for a handful of colonists on a distant island, when Spanish cannons might soon be battering English shores. Raleigh, White's primary sponsor, was himself occupied with defensive preparations. His wealth and ships were committed to protecting the realm, not rescuing a struggling colony. White spent the winter of 1587 in agonizing limbo. He wrote letters to anyone with influence, pleading for ships, supplies, anything. He mortgaged his own property to raise funds. He haunted the docks, searching for captains willing to risk the Atlantic crossing during the dangerous winter months. None would sail. The weather was too treacherous, they said. The Spanish, too numerous. Their ships were needed at home. "Come back in spring," they told him. "Come back when the war is over." Spring of 1588 arrived with heightened panic. Spanish intelligence suggested the Armada would sail in summer, timing their attack for optimal weather. Queen Elizabeth ordered coastal fortifications strengthened. Troops drilled on village greens across England. Churches held special services praying for deliverance from Catholic invasion. In this atmosphere of existential dread, White's pleas for help seemed absurdly trivial. His daughter and granddaughter were suffering, yes, but England's entire population faced potential slaughter or subjugation. The Armada sailed in July of 1588, 130 ships carrying 30,000 men. They came with blessed banners and papal approval, convinced God favored their righteous invasion. English forces met them in the Channel, smaller ships darting among the Spanish behemoths, firing and retreating, harrying without directly engaging. The battle lasted 9 days, a running fight up the English coast. Spanish ships, heavy and slow, struggled against England's more maneuverable vessels. Then weather intervened. A storm scattered the Armada, driving ships onto rocks and shoals. Those that survived fled north around Scotland, attempting to return home by circling Britain entirely. England had survived. Barely. The national celebration lasted weeks. Bonfires blazed. Churches overflowed with Thanksgiving services. Queen Elizabeth rode through London on a white horse, acknowledging the crowds who credited her with divine protection. But while England rejoiced, John White counted the cost. The Armada crisis had consumed an entire year. It was now autumn of 1588, 13 months since he had left Roanoke. The colonists' supplies would be long exhausted. What were they eating? Had they maintained peace with the Croatoan? Had disease struck? Had his daughter survived childbirth complications? Had baby Virginia lived through her first winter in that hostile environment? White secured promises of ships for spring of 1589, but winter brought new complications. Raleigh's finances were depleted by war expenses. Several promised investors withdrew their support. The ships White finally obtained were small, poorly equipped, intended more for privateering than colonial relief. The captains agreed to stop at Roanoke only if they could first raid Spanish shipping in the Caribbean. White had no choice but to accept these terms. The expedition departed in March of 1589, but disaster struck almost immediately. Off the coast of Morocco, they encountered French pirates. A battle ensued. White was wounded by a sword slash across his head, bleeding profusely as the ships retreated back to England. The expedition was abandoned. White spent months recovering, his injury severe enough that he struggled with dizzy spells and blinding headaches for the rest of his life. The scar tissue on his scalp served as permanent reminder of how close he had come, how thoroughly circumstances conspired against him. Another year passed. 1589 became 1590. White's desperation transformed into something darker, a gnawing certainty that he had condemned his family through his absence. He imagined Eleanor watching the horizon for ships that never came. He imagined Virginia's first steps, first words, spoken in his absence. He imagined them starving, sick, terrified. The images haunted his sleep. He wrote letters he could never send, apologies for broken promises, explanations that could not bridge 3 years of silence. Finally, in March of 1590, White secured passage on a privateering expedition led by John Watts. 3 ships, the Hopewell, the John Evangelist, and the Little John. The captains agreed to stop at Roanoke after raiding Spanish targets in the Caribbean. It was White's last chance. He was aging, his health broken by the head wound, his finances exhausted. If this expedition failed, he would never see Roanoke again. The ships spent months in the Caribbean, attacking Spanish settlements and capturing treasure ships. White endured the delays with gritted teeth, knowing each passing day made the colonists' survival less likely. By the time the expedition finally turned north toward Roanoke, it was August of 1590. 3 years had passed since White's departure. 3 years of silence, of absence, of prayers unanswered. The ships approached the Outer Banks. White stood at the rail, scanning the coastline for smoke, for signals, for any sign of life. What he would find would haunt him until his death. August 18th, 1590. John White's 67th birthday, and the 3rd anniversary of his granddaughter's birth. The ships anchored off Roanoke as evening fell, too late to safely navigate the treacherous shoals in darkness. White stood on deck through the night, unable to sleep, staring at the dark shape of the island against the slightly lighter sky. No fires burned on shore, no lights flickered in the settlement. The silence felt wrong, but White told himself the colonists had learned caution. They would not advertise their presence to potential enemies after dark. At first light, the landing party prepared to go ashore. White insisted on being in the first boat, despite his age and lingering head injury. As they rowed toward the beach, one of the sailors spotted smoke rising from the island's interior. White's heart surged with hope. Smoke meant fires. Fires meant people. They were alive. They had survived. Everything he had endured, every delay and disappointment, had been worth it, because his family was waiting for him on that island. The boats reached shore in mid-morning. The beach showed no footprints, no signs of recent activity. The party climbed the sandy embankment and pushed through thick vegetation that had overgrown what were once cleared paths. White recognized landmarks, trees he had sketched 3 years earlier, but everything was wilder now, reclaimed by nature with disturbing speed. They called out as they walked, shouting greetings, announcing their arrival. Only birds answered, their cries mocking in the heavy, humid air. The palisade came into view through the trees. It still stood, though vines had woven through the wooden posts and several sections leaned at dangerous angles. The main gate hung open. White quickened his pace, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He called his daughter's name. He called for Manteo, for Ananias, for any of the colonists. The silence pressed down like a physical weight. Inside the fort, the scene was surreal. Houses remained standing, but empty. Doors hung open. Windows gaped like vacant eyes. But this was not the chaos of sudden attack. Possessions had been removed methodically. Heavy items like iron cooking pots and tools were gone, clearly taken rather than abandoned. Lighter personal items, fragments of broken pottery, scraps of cloth, lay scattered but not strewn. It looked like a planned departure, an organized evacuation, not a panicked flight or violent massacre. White searched every structure, his desperation mounting with each empty room. Eleanor's house, the one he had helped build before his departure, contained nothing. No furniture, no clothing, No trace of his daughter or granddaughter. The small cradle he had carved for Virginia was gone. He had imagined finding them here, imagined Virginia running to him, a 3-year-old child who would not remember her grandfather, but might learn to love him again. Instead, he found absence so complete, it felt deliberate. The party spread through the settlement, searching for clues. One sailor found remnants of armor and metal items buried near the fort's edge, carefully hidden as if the colonists intended to return for them later. Another discovered the remains of a garden, now overgrown, but showing evidence of cultivation more recent than 3 years prior. Someone had tended these plants within the last year, perhaps within months. But where had they gone? White examined the fort's defenses. Sections of the palisade had been reinforced, newer posts added among the older construction. The colonists had worked on fortifications after his departure, suggesting they felt threatened enough to improve their defenses. But not so threatened they fled immediately. Timeline reconstruction suggested the settlement had been occupied for at least a year, possibly 2 after White's departure, but when had they left? And why? The smoke they had seen from the ships proved to be wildfire, a natural burn in the forest with no human origin. That brief hope extinguished, White focused on finding the message he had instructed the colonists to leave. He walked the perimeter of the fort, examining trees and posts. Near the entrance, carved into a post at eye level, he found it. 5 letters, carved deeply into the wood, weathered but still clearly readable. Croat. Not complete. No ON to finish the word Croatoan. Just these 5 letters, as if the carver had been interrupted or had run out of space on the post. White felt his stomach tighten. This was supposed to provide answers, but it only raised new questions. Did Croat mean Croatoan Island? The Croatoan people? Something else entirely? He examined the carving closely. No Maltese cross appeared anywhere near it. According to the protocol he had established, no cross meant they left voluntarily, without immediate danger. But why carve an incomplete message? The party continued searching. On a tree near the entrance to the fort, they found 3 more letters carved into the bark. CRO. Again, incomplete. Again, no cross. 2 partial messages, both suggesting the same destination but neither finished. White could not understand why. It would take only seconds to complete the word. Why leave it unfinished? They searched until darkness forced them to return to the ships. White carried nothing back but questions. The colonists were gone. They had left voluntarily. The absence of crosses suggested as much. They had gone somewhere, possibly Croatoan Island 50 miles south. But the incomplete carvings troubled him. So did the buried items, the careful removal of possessions, the reinforced fortifications. These details painted a picture of planned departure, yet also of uncertainty, as if the colonists themselves did not know their ultimate destination when they left. That night aboard the Hopewell, White pleaded with the expedition's commander to sail south to Croatoan Island. They could investigate. They could find the colonists, or at least learn what happened to them. The commander initially agreed, but dawn brought disaster. A storm had moved in during the night. The ships dragged anchor, nearly running aground. 2 anchors were lost. The crews, exhausted and eager to return home with their Caribbean plunder, refused to risk their lives searching for colonists who might already be dead. They would sail for England immediately. White begged. He offered money he did not have. He threatened. He wept. Nothing moved them. The ships turned east, leaving Roanoke behind. White stood at the stern, watching the island disappear, knowing he would never return. knowing he had failed in the most fundamental way a father and grandfather could fail. He had abandoned them once out of duty. Now, circumstance forced him to abandon them again, this time forever. The incomplete carvings became the foundation of every theory that followed. Croatoan and CRO, two fragments of what should have been a simple message. John White spent his remaining years obsessing over those letters, sketching them in journals, analyzing every possibility. He died in 1606, never knowing what became of his family, the mystery consuming him even as age and illness finally claimed him. The Croatoan connection seemed obvious on its surface. The Croatoan people inhabited Hatteras Island, located approximately 50 miles south of Roanoke, along the Outer Banks. Unlike the hostile Socotan, the Croatoan had maintained generally peaceful relations with the English. Manteo, the Croatoan man who served as interpreter and intermediary for the colony, had been elevated to Lord of Roanoke by White himself. If the colonists needed refuge, if circumstances forced them to abandon their settlement, seeking shelter with the Croatoan made strategic sense. But the incomplete nature of the carvings suggested complications. If the colonists had safely reached Croatoan territory and integrated with the tribe, why not finish the word? Why leave two partial messages instead of one complete instruction? Some historians have suggested the carvers were interrupted, perhaps by approaching danger, forced to flee before completing their task. But this contradicts the absence of Maltese crosses. White's protocol was explicit. Carve a cross if leaving under duress. No crosses appeared anywhere in the settlement. Another explanation suggests the colonists split into groups, heading to different destinations. Perhaps some went to Croatoan Island, while others traveled inland, seeking shelter with different tribes or attempting to establish a new settlement away from the exposed coastline. The partial carvings might represent hurried attempts to indicate multiple destinations, abandoned when the complexity of explaining their dispersal became too difficult to convey through simple carvings. The absence of bodies proved equally mysterious. If disease had struck, where were the graves? English burial practices were well established. Colonists would have interred their dead in marked locations, probably near the settlement or within a designated cemetery. White's party found no burial ground, no grave markers, no skeletal remains beyond the single weathered skeleton from the previous group of colonists. Either the 1587 settlers had suffered no deaths in 3 years, which seemed statistically impossible, or they had taken their dead with them, or their bodies had been disposed of in ways that left no archaeological trace. The buried metal items near the fort presented another puzzle. These were valuable possessions, pieces of armor, tools, items that would have been useful wherever the colonists went. Why bury them? The most logical explanation suggested the colonists intended to return, hiding valuable goods they could not carry to prevent theft or corrosion. But if they planned to return, why never come back? What prevented their return in the weeks, months, or years after departure? White's failure to investigate Croatoan Island represented one of history's most frustrating near misses. Had the storms delayed another day? Had the crew proven more cooperative? Had the anchors held? White might have sailed south and discovered the colonists' fate firsthand. Instead, the weather and circumstances conspired to leave the mystery unsolved. Later expeditions attempted to search Croatoan Island, but by then, decades had passed. Whatever evidence existed had been scattered by time, weather, and the movements of indigenous peoples who had no reason to preserve English artifacts. The Jamestown colony established in 1607, provided the next chapter in the search for Roanoke's vanished settlers. Captain John Smith, leader of the Jamestown venture, heard rumors from indigenous informants about English people living among interior tribes. These reports were frustratingly vague, mentioning pale-skinned individuals who dressed like natives but spoke a foreign tongue. Some accounts described a massacre, claiming that Powhatan, the powerful chief who dominated the region, had ordered attacks on English refugees who had sought shelter with tribes under his control. One particularly intriguing report reached Jamestown in 1608. An indigenous informant claimed that 7 English people, 4 men, 2 boys, and 1 young woman, were living with a tribe near the Chowan River, approximately 50 miles inland from Roanoke. The description of the young woman sparked immediate speculation. Could this be Virginia Dare, now 21 years old, alive among the natives? Jamestown sent an expedition to investigate, but they found nothing. Either the information was false, or the English refugees had moved again, or they had died in the interval between report and investigation. Other rumors persisted for decades. English colonists in the 1620s reported meeting indigenous people with gray eyes and lighter skin, physical characteristics suggesting European ancestry. Some of these individuals supposedly spoke fragments of English, though whether learned from Roanoke colonists or from later European contacts remained unclear. The Lumbee people of North Carolina, descendants of various indigenous tribes in the region, maintained oral traditions about incorporating English refugees into their communities. Certain Lumbee surnames matched those of Roanoke colonists. Dare, Cooper, and others appeared in tribal records from later centuries. But oral tradition and fragmentary reports do not constitute proof. They suggest possibilities without confirming facts. The truth of what happened to the Roanoke colonists remained obscured by time, by the deaths of those who witnessed events firsthand, by the lack of written records from indigenous peoples who might have known. The Croatoan themselves left no written accounts. Their history survived through oral tradition, vulnerable to the distortions and losses that affect all stories passed through generations without textual preservation. White died in 1606, probably in Ireland, where he had retired after his final failed attempt to reach Roanoke. His will mentioned his estate, but not his family. He never remarried after his wife's death. He produced no more children. The Roanoke colony represented the end of his bloodline, Virginia Dare being his only grandchild. Whatever became of Eleanor and Virginia, whatever fate claimed the 115 colonists, they took their stories into silence so complete that centuries of investigation have failed to fully dispel it. The integration theory remains the most widely accepted explanation among historians, though acceptance does not equal proof. It suggests the colonists, facing starvation and isolation, dispersed among indigenous communities willing to absorb them. This would explain the absence of bodies, the methodical removal of possessions, and the lack of Maltese crosses indicating duress. But integration implies cooperation, and cooperation requires trust that may not have existed after the George Howe murder and the disastrous raid that killed Croatoan allies. Manteo's presence offered the colonists one viable connection to indigenous society. As a Croatoan who had traveled to England, converted to Christianity, and maintained loyalty to the English, he represented a bridge between cultures. His mother was a tribal leader on Hatteras Island, giving him influence and authority. If anyone could negotiate safe passage for the colonists into Croatoan society, it was Manteo. The carved messages pointing toward Croatoan territory support this theory, suggesting he successfully convinced the tribe to accept the desperate English refugees. But absorption into another culture does not happen overnight, nor does it occur without friction. The colonists would have arrived as burdens, additional mouths to feed in a subsistence economy where food shortages were common. They spoke no Algonquian. They knew nothing of local fishing and hunting techniques. They carried strange beliefs, strange customs, strange diseases. Indigenous communities that accepted them would have taken on significant risk for uncertain benefit. What could the colonists offer in exchange for food and shelter? The answer might lie in their possessions. European tools, metal implements, even knowledge of firearms and fortification construction represented valuable assets. A tribe that incorporated English refugees had gained access to technology and expertise that could provide advantages over rivals. This pragmatic calculation might have outweighed the burden of feeding additional people, at least initially. Over time, as English refugees learned native languages and survival techniques, they would have become less burden and more member, their European origins gradually fading into tribal identity. Physical evidence supports this gradual assimilation. The Lumbee people of Robeson County, North Carolina, have maintained for centuries that they descend partially from Roanoke colonists. Their claim rests on several foundations: surnames matching Roanoke colonist families, oral traditions describing English ancestors, and physical characteristics suggesting mixed European and indigenous ancestry. Genetic studies conducted in recent decades show Lumbee DNA does contain European markers, though definitively linking these to Roanoke rather than later European contact remains scientifically challenging. Historical records from the 1600s mention English-speaking indigenous people encountered by later colonists. These accounts describe individuals who could communicate in broken English, who possessed English surnames, who told stories of ancestors who came from across the ocean. One account from 1654 describes a native man named Croatoan who claimed descent from English colonists and spoke enough English to serve as translator. Whether this man descended from Roanoke settlers or learned English through later contact with Jamestown colonists cannot be determined, but the timing and location suggest Roanoke connections. However, not all theories assume peaceful integration. The Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of tribes that dominated the region when Jamestown was established, may have viewed English refugees as threats requiring elimination. Chief Powhatan reportedly told Jamestown colonists that he had ordered attacks on English people living among tribes within his territory, describing massacres that occurred years before Jamestown's founding. If accurate, these accounts suggest some Roanoke colonists survived long enough to integrate with interior tribes, but were later killed when Powhatan decided their presence threatened his control. The timing fits disturbingly well. Powhatan consolidated power throughout the 1590s and early 1600s, absorbing or destroying rival tribes. English refugees living with these tribes would have been caught in this expansion, killed not because they were English, but because they allied with tribes Powhatan considered enemies. This scenario explains why later searches found no trace of the colonists. They had integrated, survived for years, then been systematically eliminated during tribal conflicts that had nothing to do with their origins. Another possibility involves factional splits among the colonists themselves. Not everyone may have agreed on seeking indigenous help. Some might have attempted to sail to Jamestown's intended location in the Chesapeake Bay, hoping to encounter relief ships or establish an independent settlement. Others might have chosen to remain near the coast, building a smaller, more defensible position away from Roanoke proper. The partial carvings could represent compromise, a main group heading to Croatoan, while dissenting factions pursued alternative plans. Archaeological evidence discovered near the Chowan River, approximately 50 miles northwest of Roanoke, suggests English presence in the 1590s. Excavations uncovered European artifacts, including gun parts, tools, and pottery fragments dated to the period immediately following the Roanoke abandonment. These items appeared alongside indigenous artifacts, indicating cohabitation or trade. Whether these objects came from Roanoke colonists or from earlier expeditions remains debated, but their presence confirms English people lived in that region during the relevant time frame. The integration theory provides comfort because it suggests the colonists survived, that Eleanor Dare and Virginia Dare lived out their lives among the Croatoan or other tribes, that the disappearance was not death, but transformation. This narrative transforms tragedy into adaptation, loss into survival. But comfort and truth are not synonyms. The colonists might have integrated peacefully. They might have been massacred. They might have died of disease before reaching any safe haven. The carved messages and absent bodies permit all these interpretations, confirming none. Scientific analysis has revealed a factor the colonists could not have anticipated, and John White never knew existed. Tree ring data collected from ancient bald cypress trees in the region shows that 1587 through 1589 marked the beginning of the worst drought in 800 years. The timing was catastrophic. The colonists arrived during a period of extreme environmental stress that would have made survival nearly impossible, even under ideal circumstances. Drought means crop failure. The English brought seeds for wheat, barley, and other European crops that required consistent rainfall. These plants, already struggling in unfamiliar soil and climate, would have withered during the prolonged dry spell. Indigenous crops like corn and beans, better adapted to local conditions, might have fared slightly better, but still would have produced drastically reduced yields. The colonists, inexperienced with New World agriculture and dependent on successful harvest for winter survival, faced starvation within months of White's departure. Water shortages compound in ways that extend beyond thirst. Wells dry up or become brackish as salt water intrudes from the surrounding ocean. Fish populations decline as streams and ponds shrink or disappear entirely. Game animals migrate away from drought-stricken regions, following water sources to areas far from human settlements. The entire ecosystem contracts, and with it, every food source the colonists depended upon vanishes or becomes dangerously scarce. Indigenous peoples had strategies for surviving droughts, accumulated knowledge passed through generations about which plants remained edible when others failed, about where to find water during dry years, about how to preserve food and ration supplies. The Roanoke colonists possessed none of this knowledge. They had arrived expecting to learn farming techniques gradually, to trade with natives for food while establishing their own agricultural base. Drought destroyed this plan. There was no surplus food to trade for. Indigenous communities had barely enough for themselves. Disease would have followed starvation with horrifying predictability. Malnutrition weakens immune systems, making people vulnerable to infections that healthy bodies might resist. The colonists lived in close quarters within their fort, perfect conditions for disease transmission. Typhoid, dysentery, influenza, any number of illnesses could have swept through the population. Without adequate medical supplies, which were certainly depleted within months of White's departure, even minor illnesses became death sentences. Children would have died first. Virginia Dare, born in August of 1587, would have been weaning age when the drought reached its peak severity in 1588. Infants transitioning from breast milk to solid food require adequate nutrition for development. Malnourished mothers produce less milk. Contaminated water causes deadly intestinal diseases in young children. The mortality rate for children under 5 in even well-supplied colonial settlements often exceeded 50%. Under drought conditions, with failing crops and contaminated water sources, that rate would have climbed far higher. The buried metal items near the fort take on darker significance when viewed through the lens of environmental catastrophe. Perhaps the colonists did not bury these goods intending to return. Perhaps they buried them because they were too weak to carry them, preserving valuable items in hope that relief ships would eventually arrive to recover them. The methodical removal of lighter possessions suggests people still capable of planning and moving, but the abandoned heavy items indicate physical limitation. Starvation produces weakness that makes even simple tasks exhausting. Another environmental theory suggests the colonists attempted to return to England by boat. Desperate people make desperate choices. If they concluded that white was never coming back, that waiting meant slow death, they might have attempted to sail home using small boats or vessels salvaged from previous expeditions. This would explain the complete disappearance without bodies. They would have launched from Roanoke's shores and sailed east, hoping to encounter Spanish or French ships that might rescue them, or miraculously reach England through navigation skills they almost certainly did not possess. Such an attempt would have ended in certain death. Small boats cannot survive Atlantic storms. Navigation without proper instruments and charts is essentially impossible. Even if the colonists managed to avoid storms and maintain course, they would have run out of food and water long before reaching Europe. Their bodies would have washed overboard or gone down with the boats when they inevitably foundered. No trace would remain except the abandoned settlement and carved messages, indicating their intended departure point, Croatoan Island, where they might have gathered before attempting the suicidal ocean crossing. Hurricane activity offers another environmental explanation. The Outer Banks faced devastating storms regularly, and the late 1580s saw several particularly violent hurricane seasons. A direct hit on Roanoke Island could have destroyed the settlement, killed colonists, and scattered evidence into the surrounding waters. Storm surge can reach 15 feet or higher, completely submerging low-lying islands. Bodies would have been swept out to sea. Structures would have been obliterated. Survivors, if any existed, would have fled inland to escape further storms, leaving behind only the elevated ground where the carved messages stood above floodwaters. The environmental catastrophe theory explains much, but struggles with certain details. If disease or starvation killed the colonists, where are the bodies? If they died attempting to sail home, why carve messages pointing to Croatoan? If hurricanes destroyed the settlement, why did the palisade remain partially standing when white arrived? Environmental factors certainly played crucial roles in the colony's failure, but they may not tell the complete story. Drought, disease, and storms were obstacles the colonists faced, perhaps contributing causes to their disappearance. But the ultimate explanation likely involves human decisions made under environmental stress rather than environment alone determining fate. Modern archaeology has transformed the search for Roanoke's colonists from speculation into systematic investigation. Ground-penetrating radar, DNA analysis, isotope testing, and advanced dating techniques allow researchers to detect evidence invisible to previous generations. Yet even with technology that would seem like magic to John White, definitive answers remain frustratingly elusive. The mystery persists not from lack of effort, but from the sheer difficulty of locating 400-year-old evidence scattered across hundreds of square miles of coastal terrain that has been reshaped by centuries of storms, erosion, and human activity. The First Colony Foundation has coordinated much of the recent archaeological work. In 2012, researchers examining one of John White's maps discovered hidden markings that had been covered by patches. When these patches were removed using modern imaging techniques, symbols appeared indicating a location approximately 50 miles inland from Roanoke, near the Albemarle Sound. This matched historical accounts of colonists potentially moving to interior sites. Excavations at the location, dubbed Site X, uncovered European artifacts from the late 16th century. Gun parts, pottery fragments, and metal tools consistent with English colonial possessions. These discoveries proved English presence at inland sites during the relevant time frame, but did not definitively link the artifacts to Roanoke colonists. Earlier expeditions had also explored the region. Traders might have left similar objects. Indigenous peoples who had contact with Europeans could have acquired and discarded these items. The artifacts proved possibility, not certainty. Still, the concentration of materials dated to the 1580s and 90s, found at a location marked on White's own map, suggested intentional settlement rather than random deposition. Hatteras Island, the former territory of the Croatoan people, has yielded even more intriguing evidence. Excavations begun in the 1990s uncovered a site showing sustained European presence during the post-Roanoke period. English-style construction techniques appeared alongside indigenous building methods. Metal objects, glass beads, and ceramics of European origin were found mixed with native pottery and tools. Carbon dating placed occupation between 1590 and 1650, exactly when Roanoke colonists or their descendants would have lived, if they successfully integrated with the Croatoan. The most compelling evidence came from a single iron ring, a type used in English swords during the Elizabethan period. Metallurgical analysis confirmed its European manufacture and late 16th century origin. It was discovered in a layer dated to approximately 1600, suggesting someone possessed this object decades after the Roanoke abandonment. Was it carried by a colonist who survived, traded to indigenous peoples, salvaged from the abandoned settlement? The ring proves English presence, but cannot specify which English people or why they were there. DNA studies have focused on the Lumbee people, whose oral traditions claim Roanoke ancestry. Initial genetic surveys showed European DNA markers, consistent with 16th century English populations, but also consistent with later colonial contact. Isolating specifically Roanoke-era genetic contributions from the general European admixture proves technically challenging. Mitochondrial DNA studies attempted to trace maternal lineages that might connect modern Lumbee families to documented Roanoke colonists like Eleanor Dare. But the passage of 400 years and extensive genetic mixing has obscured clear connections. The DNA evidence suggests European ancestry, but cannot conclusively prove Roanoke origins. Forensic anthropologists have also examined skeletal remains found throughout coastal North Carolina, searching for bones that might belong to Roanoke colonists. Isotope analysis can reveal where people lived during their lifetimes, based on the chemical signatures absorbed from local water and food. Several skeletons found near Hatteras showed isotope patterns consistent with English origins, indicating these individuals spent their early years in Britain before coming to America. Dating these remains precisely enough to confirm they died in the 1590s rather than later decades has proven difficult. Bone degradation and contamination from burial environments compromise radiocarbon dating accuracy. The search extends underwater as well. Marine archaeologists have surveyed the waters around Roanoke and the Outer Banks, searching for ship remains that might indicate colonists attempting to sail away. The seafloor has yielded numerous shipwrecks from the 16th and 17th centuries, but identifying specific vessels and connecting them to Roanoke requires preserved ship timbers, cargo, or other datable materials. Most wrecks are too degraded for definitive identification. The ocean keeps its secrets effectively. Technology continues advancing, offering new investigative possibilities. Satellite imagery and LiDAR mapping can detect subtle ground disturbances, indicating buried structures or earthworks. Advanced DNA sequencing methods might eventually isolate Roanoke-specific genetic markers. Improved radiocarbon dating techniques could narrow timeframes for archaeological finds. Each technological advance brings hope that this will be the year the mystery finally yields to scientific scrutiny. Yet every discovery generates new questions. Site X proved English presence inland, but not why they went there or how long they survived. The Hatteras Ring confirmed European objects reached indigenous communities, but not through what mechanism. The Lumbee DNA showed European ancestry, but could not specify which Europeans or when they arrived. Each answer illuminates a small portion of the larger picture, while leaving vast areas in shadow. The colonists dispersed. That much seems clear. Some probably integrated with indigenous tribes. Others likely died from disease, starvation, or violence. A few might have attempted desperate escapes, but the specific fates of specific individuals, the ultimate outcomes for Eleanor Dare and Virginia Dare, the sequence of decisions and disasters that led from thriving settlement to total disappearance. These details remain locked in soil and sediment, waiting for technology or luck to finally expose them to light. The Roanoke mystery has transcended historical curiosity to become foundational American mythology. It appears in novels, films, television shows, and countless retellings that reshape the disappearance to fit contemporary anxieties. Some versions emphasize supernatural explanations. Colonists spirited away at forces beyond understanding. Others focus on indigenous peoples as either saviors or destroyers, projecting modern racial attitudes onto historical events. The true story, messy and incomplete, gets buried beneath layers of fictional elaboration that often reveals more about the storytellers than the actual colonists. This cultural appropriation of Roanoke serves a psychological function. The lost colony represents every fear about the fragility of civilization, about how quickly the familiar can dissolve into the unknown. It reminds Americans that their national origin story contains fundamental gaps, moments where the historical record simply stops and speculation begins. For a culture that values documentation and certainty, Roanoke's resistance to explanation feels almost personally offensive, a challenge that demands response, even when response proves impossible. The obsession with solving the mystery also reflects changing attitudes about historical investigation itself. Earlier generations accepted that some questions had no answers, that the past kept secrets that would never be revealed. Modern sensibility rejects this resignation. We possess technology capable of reading erased text from ancient scrolls, of extracting DNA from millennia-old bones, of seeing through solid earth to detect buried structures. Surely, the thinking goes, we can determine what happened to 115 people less than 500 years ago. The fact that we cannot, despite enormous effort and sophisticated tools, forces confrontation with the limits of knowledge. Virginia Dare has become the emotional center of the mystery, the infant whose fate seems to demand resolution more urgently than the adults who accompanied her. She was innocent, blameless, a symbol of new beginnings, whose story ended before it truly began. Numerous fictional accounts imagine her survival, her integration into native tribes, her life as a bridge between cultures. These stories provide the happy ending history refuses to confirm. They transform tragedy into triumph, loss into adaptation. They allow audiences to believe the disappearance was not death, but transformation. That somewhere in the tangled genealogies of indigenous and European descent, Virginia Dare's bloodline persists. But this focus on Virginia Dare, while emotionally satisfying, obscures the 114 other colonists whose fates matter equally. They were not symbols. They were people with names and histories, hopes and fears. They made decisions under circumstances we can barely imagine, facing choices between equally terrible options. Should they stay and starve, or leave and risk unknown dangers? Should they trust indigenous peoples who had reason to hate English violence or rely on relief ships that might never come? Should they remain together or split up to increase survival odds? Every decision carried potentially fatal consequences, and they made these choices with incomplete information, under extreme stress, without any guarantee of rescue. The mystery endures because it touches something deeper than historical curiosity. It asks what happens when everything you know disappears, when the familiar structures of life dissolve and you must rebuild from nothing in hostile territory. It asks how long identity persists when circumstances demand its abandonment. If the colonists integrated with indigenous tribes, at what point did they stop being English and become something else? When Eleanor Dare taught Virginia the Croatoan language, if she did, was that preservation of culture or its extinction? These questions apply far beyond 16th century Roanoke. They resonate with every immigrant, every refugee, every person forced to navigate between the culture they knew and the culture they must join to survive. Perhaps the mystery's power lies precisely in its incompleteness. A solved mystery becomes history, interesting but settled. An unsolved mystery remains alive, demanding engagement, inviting speculation. Each generation approaches Roanoke with new tools and perspectives, finding in the carved word Croatoan whatever meaning their particular moment requires. For some, it represents indigenous assistance and cultural integration. For others, it signals displacement and loss. Still others see it as evidence of resilience, of human capacity to survive through adaptation, even when that adaptation erases the original identity. John White died never knowing. Eleanor Dare vanished never explaining. Virginia Dare grew up, if she grew up at all, in circumstances we cannot reconstruct. 112 other colonists made choices and faced consequences that history cannot document. They left behind a single word, incomplete messages, and questions that 400 years of investigation have failed to answer definitively. Maybe that is the lesson Roanoke teaches. Not everything resolves. Not every question gets answered. Not every disappearance yields to scrutiny, no matter how sophisticated our tools become. The colonists walked into the wilderness, and the wilderness swallowed them so completely that even their bones seem to have dissolved into the soil. We search because we must, because unanswered questions gnaw at human consciousness, demanding resolution. But Roanoke may be teaching us that some mysteries are meant to endure, that some silences cannot be broken, that some disappearances remain permanent, no matter how desperately we seek explanation. The carved letters still speak across centuries. Croatoan, a destination, a people, a word that means everything and nothing, pointing toward answers that perpetually recede the closer we approach them. If this story haunts you, if the mystery of those 115 vanished souls keeps you awake tonight, then hit that like button, because you understand that the darkest stories are often the ones without endings. Subscribe to join our community of people who refuse to look away from history's uncomfortable silences, who understand that the questions we cannot answer often matter more than the ones we can. Drop a comment telling us which unsolved historical mystery disturbs you most, what disappearance you think about when the lights go out. We are building something here, a space where the past is not sanitized or simplified, but examined honestly, completely, disturbingly. The truth is rarely comforting, but it is always worth pursuing. Welcome to the community that does not flinch from darkness.